Good morning. So, what do you think makes a good leader? I have a bit of a knack for asking big questions at uncomfortable times, like right before the coffee break. So let's do this. So think of one skill, just real quick, and share it with the person sitting next to you. Doesn't have to be perfect. So you may have thought of things like some of the things that are in here. Goal orientation, innovation, getting things done, authenticity, or introspection. There's so many more, but maybe the even more important question is, what do you think makes you a good leader? I'd be curious to hear what came up for you, and if you want to share, tell me later. I'll be at the conference all day. Because it might be one of many things. It could be that you think living up to your values and leading up to your values makes you a good leader. Or that the business needs and the work are aligned with what you value. Or it's about what your boss thinks of you and how they perceive your work. Or what your employees want and wish. Or the results that you get. Or, of course, how you got those results. Now, is a good leader at the intersection of all of those? There are, of course, negotiations between those aspects, and they're a part of many of our daily lives. And oftentimes, and maybe ideally, this negotiation is much less noticeable or explicit because all of those things pretty much align. And if you're in a position like that, that can be really great. But what when those things aren't as aligned anymore? I've been in such situations, and I've frequently also worked with leaders who wondered how long they could still stay in a job that was increasingly demanding things of them that were not aligned with their values. These kinds of questions don't get easier by most of us having to do small things like, pay rent, buy food for ourselves and our families. And when that happens, that kind of misalignment, how do our ideas and ideals of leadership really hold up in reality? So today I want to explore 3 ideas of leadership with you and talk about what we talk about when we talk about leadership. And the first one is, of course, innovation. It's a big part of a lot of leadership conversations, and I want to begin with one that we've been talking about a lot. This is something I've literally seen on roadmaps, and too many times. And some of you may have too, given the reactions I'm hearing right now. And for anyone who's been in tech for more than, say, a year or two, this may sound familiar. We had something with AI, then with VR, NFTs, machine learning, the blockchain, social media, mobile phones, the internet, personal computers, fire, and rocks, and maybe some other stuff before then. The tech industry prides itself in innovation. That's, of course, also a fun and exciting and interesting part of our work. But too often, it also means that we all follow the same hypes, trends, and patterns, and often go into extremes. The herd mentality in our industry is really, really strong, because the concern about missing out on the next big thing is very real. And for 1 or 2 companies, it tends to be actual innovation. But for the rest, it very quickly becomes herd mentality. And I get it. I've seen this many times. It's the next big thing, says your boss. And TechCrunch. You hear it's where all VC is going now. Your customers will ask for it any day now, and your investors and your board. Hacker News says, if you're not on it already, it's already too late. Your competition's probably already on it, or probably even certainly. Your employees will ask about it any minute, and product, of course. You'll need it if you want to raise more money. Every conference has sessions about it. And while you wasted time thinking about it, your competitor just posted on LinkedIn that they're working on it. And oh, what's that sound? It's Slack. Your boss is asking when you'll ship it. Casey Newton, a technology journalist, recently described this kind of dynamic really well on the Search Engine podcast in an episode about OpenAI. He said, Sam Altman got spooked that his rival Anthropic was going to release their product Claude first and might steal their thunder. And so they released ChatGPT to get out in front of Claude. And that was essentially the starting gun that launched the entire AI race. Going on with Casey's quote, I think it is fundamental to how Sam sees the world that all of this stuff is inevitable. And if it's going to happen anyway, all other things being equal, you would rather be the person who did it, right? And get the credit and the glory and the users and the revenue. AI developers might care about safety, but in the rush to be the first in the field, the company who wins could actually be the company who cares about safety the least. And this race has come with a hefty price tag. This is just a very small list of issues with companies running this type of hype race. I won't read all of them out loud because then that's going to be a 10-hour talk. And again, you should get your coffee. But just a few examples. 2015, Google Photos labels black people as gorillas. 2016, smart home devices in Germany, including cameras, stream from inside people's homes. Facebook in 2017, their algorithms substantially contribute to ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. In 2022, ChatGPT is released with hallucinations, biases, and copyright questions. In 2023, 6 years later, Google and also Apple Photos still can't find gorillas. They couldn't fix the actual issues, so they just shut down the ability to label gorillas altogether. 2024, Snap, the company behind Snapchat, that's already since 2017 been on law enforcers' radar, dismissed employee concerns over 10,000 and more monthly reports of sextortion. In a statement, the company says, addressing child grooming would create privacy issues and be too expensive. Meanwhile, in April, the AI company Scale published an AI readiness report, where 62% of companies reported increased process efficiency internally, and only 8% had seen failed AI projects. How? I can't get ChatGPT to write a coherent and accurate summary of a blog post that I wrote myself to cross-post on LinkedIn. And you're telling me that 34% of executive teams are using it to assist their strategic decision-making? How bad have things been on your executive teams before? And in an earnings call just a few weeks ago, Google CEO Sundar Pichai claimed that Google now 25% of code is AI-generated and then reviewed and accepted by developers. So do we think that Google has, previously already, tracked how often its users use code completion or code snippets pre-AI? Or are we talking just 25% of boilerplate code? Or 25% of business logic? That's the same company whose AI also just created a lethal garlic oil brew recipe for a human to feed their family with. Based on what we know right now, this number is probably much more in the boilerplate direction, which will save some time, but the number is also not as impressive in terms of savings as it initially suggests. But the much more important part why I wanted to pull this quote here is Google has already bet a ton on AI. And if these things happened like they often do, they probably told all their engineers a while ago to use AI assistants for programming and told all managers to make sure that's happening. And at least those managers' bonus will probably depend on that happening. So, of course, everyone at Google now tells their CEO that, yes, of course, we use a ton of AI to produce our code, because he told them that that's what he wanted to hear. The 25% piece of information is useless to tell us anything about the quality of AI completion tools or their impact on efficiency or productivity. But it makes for really good PR and messaging to investors. And that's how that hype cycle continues. Nikhil Suresh, an executive director at Hermit Tech with a background in data science, recently wrote, there are those that have drunk the Kool-Aid, there are those that have not. And then there are those that are trying to mix up as much Kool-Aid as possible. I shall let you decide who sits in which basket. And these consequences of these hypes continue. Data centers alone are already consuming the equivalent of a top 10 energy-consuming country worldwide. Greenhouse gas emissions of Bitcoin mining alone could push global warming beyond the 2 degrees Celsius increase. And AI is accelerating climate change even further. Over the next 5 years, the data center industry is set to emit 3 times more greenhouse gas than if generative AI had not been developed. Driven by fear of missing out, tech companies frantically race after the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And meanwhile, the cost of our decisions is already being paid, just largely not by us. But temperatures have been rising here too, and like the speaker before me already showed, a few days ago a devastating flood hit many people in Valencia. we aren't shielded from this forever just because we're in the privileged West, because the consequences aren't over. Our limitless pursuit of shareholder value is burning up the planet with devastating impact on humans across the globe. In leadership, it's not called carelessness. It's called, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. Bias to action, bring a sense of urgency, disagree and commit, move fast and break things, and better beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. And even if we don't work for Google, AI, or Meta, or many of the other big companies I've just mentioned, we play a role in this. A few months ago, I worked on the Engineering Leadership Report, a survey together with LeadDev. And one of the questions that we asked technical leaders in there was, what are your biggest concerns about generative AI? We got a lot of questions along the line, or answers along the lines of, management will overly rely on the hype. Who's management? I often get questions at LeadDev about how to become an engineering director or VP or a CTO one day. And that's a really great question to talk about. But one day, many of you will be in those positions. We are management. And even if we don't work for any of those big companies, the choices that we make every day with our teams have enormous impact. So what does it mean for you and me and us? This is the first recommendation I'm going to give you for today. Lead through and not with the hype. Don't take headlines that you see at face value. Instead, get to the core of it. Ask questions like, what business problem are we trying to solve? It's a question that's shockingly often unanswered. Or questions about, how will we mitigate the risks around this? Also, good and boring engineering work is shockingly useful. It can have quite great impact, not just on the metrics of your business, but also on the environment. Make choices about who you work for and hold companies accountable. Invest in your operations and culture, and build teams and businesses that are not for fast and global scale. And also hold yourself accountable. So that was leadership idea one, the idea that we innovate, also known as hype culture. Number two, leaders get stuff done. The herd mentality that I've mentioned earlier and these hypes also apply to the layoffs that we've seen in tech. If you look for reasons, that's a quote from a professor at the Foster School of Business in Washington, if you look for reasons for why companies do layoffs, the reason is that everybody else is doing them. I've had people say to me, he said, that they know layoffs are harmful to company well-being, let alone the well-being of employees, and don't accomplish much. But everyone is doing layoffs, and their board is asking why they aren't doing layoffs also.
I really hope you're enjoying this video. Do you know LeadDev offers way more than this?
I'm a fan of the LeadDev newsletter. I find really practical knowledge about leadership.
Then I was like, oh, there is this big community here doing all of these content, so let me figure out a little more, let me dig in a little, what do you have?
So make sure you check out leaddev.com.
The recent years of layoffs have had many vast consequences for employees who are struggling to still find jobs, but also for many leads. 63% of engineering leaders are juggling increasingly broad roles and responsibilities, like filling in for more positions at once, in teams that are bigger than before, or dealing with complete chaos. And the hype cycle happens here too. Just recently, a VP engineering at a scale-up told me, it seems like everyone is having engineering managers code again, so I'll do the same. By the way, there's no data to support this claim yet. Engineering leadership roles have for a long time already been poorly defined, but are now often even more chaotic, with leaders being responsible for people management, including mentoring, development, but also technical leadership, strategy and decisions, delivery management with product and project management, and some hands-on coding. We have a word for this in German. I promise it's not an insult. The German word is eierlegende Wollmilchsau. If you would like to practice pronouncing it, find a German speaker in the audience or approach me later. It's an idiom and usually used as a joke and describes the ideal of an imaginary hybrid livestock that combines the advantages of different types of animals. We can also use it to describe a person, a solution to a problem. And it seems to only have advantages, satisfy all needs, and of course, therefore, is not real. I have stickers of those, by the way. Find me later. So These kinds of roles are real, but they're incredibly difficult to do well in at all times without burning yourself out, or your team as well in the process. And that puts even more pressure on the people in those roles. So if you're dealing with things like this, I think the talk that you saw earlier this morning had really good insight as well, and I want to add a little bit to it. This ambiguity that you and your teams are dealing with right now, push through it with as much visibility as you can. Get excellent at managing your boss. I have a guide on this linked here as well. There's also, by the way, a URL at the bottom, which gets you to resources from this talk. Document your work. That good work will not always just be seen. Don't believe that old narrative. Grow your community. Make use of the fact that you're here today. And get creative at finding or creating growth opportunities for the people on your team. I also want to look a little bit outside of tech, because many of us are still in very fortunate circumstances, even though the work in the industry has become much more tricky for many of us. So if you can and have the resources, share some of your skills, your money, your time, or energy. Like participate in a neighborhood cleanup group. I know in Berlin there's many of those, and in other places as well. Join your library, share tools with neighbors. Support local journalism. It's getting even more important against all the backdrop of the AI issues that we're dealing with. That was part 2 of leadership ideas. The idea that leaders get it done, also hustle culture. Leadership idea number 3, leaders are authentic. 56% of women leave the tech industry 10 to 20 years into their careers. That's twice the number of men. 50% of women in tech leadership roles leave them by age 35. And the number of women in tech, as well as tech leadership roles, have dropped significantly. And those who are still here feel very burnt out. I'm over 35. I've been in tech for over 15 years. Statistically, it's increasingly unlikely that I'm still here. I talked about all of this with a former boss of mine a while ago. And what he said in response was this. And I quote, "So throughout your entire career in tech, you've always been concerned that you might get harassed one day." I do want to say, I've been able to work on fundamentally fantastic projects and really impactful technology with people in this time. I've had wonderful coworkers and teammates. We've built great things together for thousands of users. I've been able to travel the world, make good friends, but also, almost from day one, this was never a hypothetical. I was sexually harassed by my startup's most important client. I was the target of online organized harassment campaigns after giving talks about diversity and inclusion in tech. I was bullied by employees and senior leaders in companies that had a really strong public image of valuing diversity and inclusion, as the only woman leader there. I was told more than once that I can't talk about those things in public because it would be a career killer and no one would take me seriously anymore. And I do want to say, that's just an excerpt, but compared to many others, many women, people of color, and queer people in leadership roles have experienced, I've been very lucky and fortunate and privileged regardless of that. But none of this was ever hypothetical. While we all talk about the latest hype, many women, people of color, queer and disabled leaders also talk about those things. And again, I'm not going to quote all of them, but just a few excerpts, like team members speaking over them and how to handle it without being labeled as bossy. It's a question someone approached me about here at LeadDev just a year ago. Being pushed into management because they're, quote unquote, good with people, despite wanting to remain technical leads. Whether they can safely attend the next company offsite because they've been unwantedly touched at previous events multiple times. What it's like to be promoted more likely when times are tough and during a company crisis, which is also statistically known and called the glass cliff. They also talk about VCs and founders who aren't safe to work with, and how long they can still hold out in their leadership roles because they do need the money and also want to protect their teams from discriminatory senior leaders, or because many hiring managers immediately disqualify people over short tenure. And how do you talk about being discriminated against in your resume? Because also many of them don't feel they can fail as the only woman or person of color in a leadership role in their company. Or, and I quote, "At least I know here who I'm dealing with and what I'm dealing with. It's not much better elsewhere anyway. These topics are new for tech overall, and I know that many of you have heard about them. And yet, there seems to be an assumption that issues like racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination only apply to employees and just disappear once someone steps into a leadership role. If I look at leadership publications, it's the same deal there. Looking at Inc.com, Harvard Business Review, or even LeadDev, or other management publications, let alone popular management and leadership newsletters, there's nothing. I've spoken about this to hundreds of people in my career, and there's usually just one group of people who are surprised that those issues exist. And it's people who aren't personally impacted by them. So what, again, makes a good leader? And how are you supposed to be authentic as a leader when your sheer presence, the essence of who you are, is making people question your abilities? That's a question that so many people in leadership have to wrestle with on a daily basis. And people of color, queer, trans leaders, disabled leaders, and women in leadership positions are just some of those groups. Authenticity is a concept for cis white men. Leadership can be a really lonely job. It can be complicated and can be stressful. But for some of us, it's lonelier, it's more complicated, and also more stressful because we aren't just accepted as who we are. As much as leadership is being talked about, this whole part is eerily quiet. Out of fear of retaliation, being considered difficult or unemployable, people don't speak up. This too is part of the leadership experience, and we need to talk about it more. But speaking about these issues has already cost too many people their careers in tech. And I can't even responsibly recommend to any individual to talk about this on the record with their name attached, unless they're done with their career anyway. So I want to leave two sets of recommendations here. The first part is if you're a person dealing with some of those things, don't go it alone. Know that you're not alone, and also know that there's a pattern, there's a history in tech of these issues. Document your experiences. That's probably the most important part here. Write down dates, names, witnesses, and things that happened. Even if you never use this document, have it. Consult a lawyer. Also very helpful to have someone in your corner. Grow your community, because again, there are many, many people who are unfortunately dealing with this stuff. And if at all possible, don't sacrifice your mental or physical health for a job, because organizations are built to function without you, and you're not. And now, if you're not personally experiencing those things, even if currently, do some things to support the people who may. Volunteer to take notes in meetings. Don't just let the woman in your leadership group always be the one who does it. Also learn about what it's like to work in tech leadership for someone who doesn't look like you. Don't let the women and people of color on your team be the only ones who talk about things like safety, ethics, culture, equity, and policy to push through the hypes that we've talked about earlier. Check in with your peers and ask what they need. Talk pay. Share with peers what you're making. There's still a significant pay gap between specifically white men and many other groups in leadership. Sharing what you make helps. Also start or support a workers' council or a Betriebsrat. And believe people over your own experience. That's probably one of the most important parts here. Because just because someone is nice to you, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that they're not terrible to others. 3 leadership ideas. Leaders innovate, leaders get it done, leaders are authentic. We've also looked at the hype culture, hustle culture, and hush culture that results. And the many parts of the leadership experience that we don't talk about as much. And I do want to emphasize, because I've given a lot of things that you can do as an individual as recommendations, but this is also important. These issues are systemic, and they're beyond any of us individually. VC money and hockey stick growth curves for companies, the herd mentality, and unfortunately, as we already know, capitalism, all of those are huge drivers in this. The more companies are pushing for fast growth and profits, and the more investors want quick returns, the harder it becomes to create an environment that is survivable to humans, no matter how much any of us individually care about people. As engineering leaders in these environments, we face increasingly complex questions with no simple answers. And at the same time, I know that many of you who are here today, who are part of this community, deeply care about the people you work with and about the future of our planet. And yes, it's also understandable to have felt powerless among all of the changes in our industry in the last years. And that's why, amid all of those big changes in our industry, I want to remind you and me and all of us, the tech industry isn't just some external force of nature. Many of us are in positions of power, and many of you may be engineering executives, founders, or CEOs in the future. Every one of us is a part of this industry. Every one of us is the tech industry. And every one of us shapes what good engineering looks like. So I want to ask you again, what do you think makes a good leader? What do you think makes you a good leader? There are three things I want you to take away from this. First, the question, what impact do you want to have, not just on your teams, but also on the small and big world around you? Part two, use your brain and heart. Leave the herd mentality to the elephants. And part three, remember, the eierlegende Wollmilchsau is not real. Thank you very much.